Me, Gerald Gay. I'm state representative for House District 36, Republican. I've served 8 years in the last 14 years.
Yeah, my name is Eric Nelson. I'm the challenger here in House District 36. I'm a Democrat. I am an attorney here in town, married with 4 kids, and this is my first foray into politics.
Thank you both for coming here. We appreciate it. So right off the bat, school funding. School districts are pounding the drum for a cost of living adjustment. You saw a couple more districts joining coalition fairly recently proposing this. Is the legislature at the right place on school funding, and why or why not? We'll start with Representative Gay, and we'll switch back.
We've had a long history since 2001 of Supreme Court meddling in where the money comes from. They put a mandate on the legislature to use state funds to make all structures uniform. Now, there's a difference in expense budget versus capital budget. CapCon was forced upon the legislature, and we saw the education department go from a part of a $1 billion state budget to, in 2 years' time, it went to $1.036 billion just for education because of a Supreme Court mandate that was forced on us. So I'm not happy about blurring the line about where state comes in on expense funding either. We're looking at a state that is losing revenue at the state level, and we need to push expense money down to more local level counties.
That's probably not going to be a very welcome message for
the state did things in the early 2000s that bankrupted counties. My colleague here can probably speak to that as well as I can. We took off sales tax, which ended up bankrupting cities and counties to the tune of $98 million per budget cycle. That's significant. That's a big makeup. And what it becomes is a shift of revenue shift from a broader base to a more specific base. The county has discretion to levy property tax. And I saw from between the years 2005 to 2007 a nearly 300% increase in property tax at the county level to make up for state revenues that were lost by manipulating sales tax at the state level. The sales tax was collected by the state and then redistributed to cities, towns, and counties on a prorated basis. Part of that was eliminated in a very popular vote, but it was not fully thought out when it was. So we lost, in that fell swoop, we lost state funding for counties. And now as we look at COLA, cost of living increases for schools, the burden's going to be on the local governments. Where do they get the revenue from? They'll have to raise their tax, but that's the situation we're in. We're looking at a declining state revenue situation and discretion on the part of counties to raise it. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, I think it's important for the state to ensure that our schools are adequately funded, and this issue that's come up with the cost of living adjustment that they're wanting to push through, or at least considering, this is a fairly new issue to me. So I think we really need to take a look at that. I mean, obviously we spend a lot per student in the state. We've put a lot of money into capital expenditure, capital construction, and that's a good thing. I mean, you know, we do have very good revenues here in the state. We've taken a lot of the general fund money and put it into rainy day accounts at a clip that really far exceeds what I think is probably prudent at this time. So I think this issue needs to be studied, and if the school districts are losing ground, then the legislature and the state needs to sit down and figure out a way to make sure that gap is closed, and we're providing our teachers and our students with the items, with the facilities that they need to have a great education. You know, that is, our children are the most important, I think, resource and asset that we as a state have, and so we have to ensure that is properly properly funded. How that mechanism will work, how that will look like, I can't say at this point. I mean, that's something I'd have to dig into, but I think definitely the state, if needed, needs to step up to the plate and make that funding available.
Medicaid expansion, and Mr. Nelson, we'll start with you this time. Should Wyoming allow for Medicaid expansion? If not, what should it do to avoid shifting costs from uncovered poor patients onto paying patients?
Yeah, so for me, this is a pretty simple issue. I think that the state of Wyoming should accept the Medicaid waiver expansion. There's approximately 17,000 uninsured Wyomingites that could have access to health care coverage if we would just accept that Medicaid expansion. And these are folks that are working in low-paying jobs without children. So it's not as if, that's the demographic that would be covered. And that federal money has been allocated. We've turned it down. We've lost over $60 million in funding because of that. Right now, it's a great deal for the state. At no point under this program would the state be on the hook for more than 10% of sort of a copay, if you will. So that's federal funding that right now that we're turning away, that other states are taking advantage of. By accepting the Medicaid expansion, these federal dollars would come into our state. They would not only help to provide health care coverage for these folks, but would also be a stimulus to our economy. And the Wyoming Medical Center, for instance, had approximately $58 million in uncompensated and charity care last year. And our hospitals, and this is a rural state, and it's very difficult to provide high-quality health care that's affordable. And the Wyoming Medical Center alone would garner $2 to $3 million a year. And now that may not sound like a lot when compared to $58 million in uncompensated care, but that margin is so slim between being afloat and being underwater that would go a long way to helping keep our healthcare system solvent. The other beauty of this is, and a criticism that I've heard, is that, well, what if the feds renege on their funds, right? And well, the fact of the matter is we could opt out at any time. So if 5 years down the road, the federal government decides that this is not something that they can continue to fund, we always have that option. So for me, it's a win-win situation. We should expand it. Not only is it, I think, the right thing to do to provide these people with health coverage so that they have access to health care, but it's also the fiscally responsible thing to do.
We're probably pretty close to on the same page with that. We've got 17,000 potentially new employee or enrollees into Medicaid, which is federally funded program. A federal dollar is really $1.40 by the time you service the federal debt. So 90% buy-in by the feds, you're looking at a 1.4 multiplier for 90% of that. The reports we get from the Department of Health Director, is that he feels he can manipulate things around and not cost the state a great amount of money. But we have the great unknown whether the feds are going to step out and leave the state holding the bill. And we're, again, looking at this in the face of declining state revenues. So we're in a precarious situation here, and this is why in the past the legislature generously funded things like the budget reserve account, the rainy day fund, in case we got to a point where our spending was in excess of what our revenue is. We've had about a 20% decline in coal production, the attendant loss in severance tax revenues. Meanwhile, we serve money to the federal government with federal mineral royalties. So as our mineral production declines, we're sending out less federal revenues to them and bringing back in federal revenues for the Medicaid expansion. So it goes out, it comes back in, and eventually what's going to happen is when there's federal shortfall, they're going to say, State of Wyoming, you pick up the ticket. So we've prepared ourselves in the past with our savings programs, rainy day account. If it gets to the rainy day account scenario, we have money on hand to make it through there. But you can't leave 17,000 people uncovered. You just can't in this day and age.
This next question is not going to be a new topic. It's one we asked you, and it's one that you've dealt with before. So, game and fish funding.
Mhm.
What's the solution here? I mean, it's an ongoing problem, stuck between rising costs, some capped fees. What would you propose as a solution for the department's funding woes?
Game and Fish is one of two big enterprise-funded agencies in the state, the other one being WYDOT. By enterprise-funded, I mean the agency is designed to be self-sufficient. Game and Fish gets most of its revenue through Pittman Robinson federal tax, and the taxes that it collects is on fishing licenses, hunting licenses, boat tickets, aquatic invasive species, conservation stamps, whatever they can collect through programs that they can put in. They're in a shortfall, but they need to economize. They've been like every other state agency is. They've expanded and expanded and expanded. Some of that's forced upon us by the feds with the wolf program, the grizzly bear, and the unmentionable problem of the sage grouse delisting. There's a big scramble out there to delist great sage grouse. What we have to remember, though, is representing our constituents. The people in my district are hunters and fishermen. What they see is a decline in opportunity to hunt and fish and a decline in quality of experience when they go out into the field. They're seeing more locked gates, less open roads, less public land available, fewer private landowners amenable to letting on a local sportsman. So what I've told the Game and Fish and what I stand by is if you want to raise license fees, raise it on non-residents. They're going to pay to get in here no matter what. Game and Fish will tell you that they have 65,000 more applications than they have licenses anyway. So there's where the room is to raise the fees. I don't want them to raise it on the local sportsmen. My residents are my constituents, and I want to protect them in this issue.
Can they make up that shortfall just by raising? I mean, you're saying economize, and I'd be interested to hear where exactly, and then increase fees on non-residents. Is that enough to cover? I mean,
that'll be up to Director Talbot. Director Talbot told me that he was able to, by attrition, retiring employees, and shifts in things like more use of the internet for application fees, he was able to make do the last couple of years with just those sort of things. So he's razor close to balancing his budget. So if he's got 65,000 excess applicants, he has room to manipulate the price of non-resident fees up and down to the point where he can probably balance his budget off that.
As far as economizing, where, as you said, a lot of their growth and costs has been mandated.
Let me give you an example. For 5 years, we've had the Aquatic Invasive Species Program. I have 2 watercraft, and I pay $30 a year tax to the Game and Fish for aquatic invasive species. I've had my watercraft inspected exactly once in 5 years. That program, when I brought that question before the Game and Fish, I said, why am I paying $15 a year for my watercraft for aquatic invasive species? Their answer back to me was, that's how we fund the program. The program isn't doing anything to eliminate or prevent aquatic invasive species. From what I see, my eyeballs are out there at the lake. I hunt, I fish, I see what goes on with the Game and Fish. That's a program that could be shrunk considerably. And that's just one example. We've got watercraft patrol, we have biology things, we have, of course, wolves and grizzly bear programs. Right now we have a program where we're helicoptering tree branches from Muddy Mountain out into Bolton Creek to encourage beavers to dam Bolton Creek to reduce siltation. If we can afford to fly by helicopter aspen branches out into Bolton Creek to support a beaver herd that doesn't even exist out there, there are places within the department where they can economize.
Yeah, so I certainly don't believe that we can cut our way to prosperity with our Game and Fish department. Certainly we want every governmental agency to run efficiently. However, it's got to be responsive. And when we look at the model that Game and Fish was predicated upon, it was primarily funded through sportsmen's license fees. And I would agree that the entire cost can't be borne by our sportsmen. However, the legislature in the state has tied Game and Fish's hands for a number of years, I think since 2008 or 2009, on license fee increases. And of course, when you go 5, 6, 7 years without increases, you're going to start to see shortfalls. So we need to, as a state, allow fair periodic increases to keep up with the cost of doing business. The second thing is with Game and Fish, we have to realize that yes, it is there to protect our game and fish for our sportsmen, but so many other industries in the state rely upon Game and Fish doing an adequate job. Our mineral industry relies on the proper management of endangered species such as the sage grouse. Next year, a decision will come whether to list that. And so if we don't properly manage that and that gets listed, then we're going to see a huge reduction in our ability to extract minerals, and that's going to cost us jobs, revenue, et cetera. So to the point, how do we fund that? Well, we need to allow periodic increases. We need to look at other funding sources. I think a start was taking some general fund money and using that to fund some of the pension and benefits of the Game and Fish employees. Also taking some general fund money and using that to fund some of the programs with regard to, say, grizzly bears and other non-game species, so that it's fair and equitable, that our sportsmen aren't footing the bill comprehensively for those things. I think it's also important to look at alternative sources of funding. I think that the lottery that was instituted here this last year raised approximately $500,000. Is that going to make up the entire shortfall? Absolutely not. But those type of innovative ideas need to continue to be explored to provide other sources for funding. It's just simply too important of an asset and resource for us to give it short shrift. I mean, tourism, our second largest industry, I mean, that's heavily dependent on the proper management of our game and fish. So I don't think that we can cut our way to making it work. I think we need to ensure that we have adequate funding sources, whether it's through general fund money or other types of sources.
As far as periodic fee increases, excuse me, you wouldn't differentiate between resident and non-resident, or would that be the discretion of Game and Fish, or how would you establish that?
I would look to the Game and Fish Department to come to the legislature with those proposals. I mean, I'm as I sit here today, I'm not apt to say that we would differentiate between the two. I don't know if they're you certainly could, but whether or not raising non-resident fees and leaving resident fees the same, if that would, I don't know the numbers, how that would pan out. But it seems to me that, if the license fee was last adjusted in 2008, well, I mean, we can only need to look at the inflation and the cost of living, what has happened since that time, to realize that in real dollars, what we're paying today for a license as a resident or non-resident is going to be less than we were paying in 2008. And I think if you do this on a periodic basis, you're not looking to make up 6 years of lost ground. If you do this, on a yearly or biannual basis, then they're going to be small incremental increases. I mean, I certainly want to ensure that Wyoming residents have access to hunting and fishing, and so we don't want to make it an onerous thing, but we need to make sure that it's fair and it's targeted so that we can properly manage the game and fish.
May I have a back-in moment with this?
Very quickly.
Very quickly. Tourism's our number 2 industry, as the gentleman said. We need to explore Game and Fish charging a non-consumptive utilization of wildlife fee. I would support that. Tourism, people that want to take photographs, just go out and look at wildlife, perhaps develop an optional pay-in or a license type system, but a non-consumptive utilization fee, I would back that for the Game and Fish to make up their shortfall.
Next question, education oversight. What would you propose to solve what one legislator called decades-long turmoil between the legislature, the State Board of Education, and the Department of Education? Charles.
Well, I think as a legislator, the best thing you can do with regard to education and oversight is not micromanage. We've seen, especially in the last couple of years, intense turmoil between the legislature, the governor's office, and the state superintendent's office. And we've seen some things done in the legislature in terms of footnotes and other things. And my position is that those education professionals, those people that are trained in education, need to be making the determinations as to what our standards should be, what are, on a local level as mandated by our state constitution. They need to determine a curriculum that works best for their students. As a legislator, I don't want to micromanage those matters. Those need to be handled by the professionals. Certainly, we need standards. We've had standards since the late 70s, and so in order to, I think, help alleviate some of that turmoil, is the legislature needs to stay out of those specific issues. And obviously, with some turnover in the state superintendent's office, hopefully that a new dialogue can be started, and some respect for the boundaries for each governmental entity's role in that decision-making process.
I agree that legislative micromanagement is inappropriate. Government closest to the people is always the best. So as close to the community as we can get to set our education standards is where we want to go with this. I can give you some in-writing examples of legislative micromanaging over the last 4 years during this chaotic period we've had. Standards for writing were put in, standards for writing taken out. Writing is held at the same time as PAWS. SAWS is a separate administration from PAWS held at a different time. Writing is in for grades 3 to 8. Writing is changed to grades 3, 5, and 7. PAWS writing is out. SAWS is in. ACT writing is in. Constructed response is in. Constructed response is out. MAP is in. Compass is in. 11th grade PAWS is out. ACT is in. Work keys is in. Work keys is out. Body of evidence is in. Body of evidence is out. ACT suite is in for grades 9, 10, and 11. The chaos is being caused by legislative micromanagement. Teachers, people who have been teachers, worked up to principal administrative positions, know how to do their job. Legislators need to back out, give them their tools, and let them do their thing, and quit fiddling around with this. The chaos is caused by the legislature.
Let's talk about the gas tax. This is something we brought up too. With legislators hike the gas tax to increase funding for roads, and this is really more about highway funding. That's only a start on a larger dollar amount. What would you propose as a solution on highway funding? I'm trying to remember which order we went in.
Federal mineral royalties coming back into Wyoming under the congressional, their transportation bill comes out every couple of years, and I go for every federal penny we can get for them, because we have I-80, which crosses Wyoming through the only divide in the Rocky Mountains, and we take a third of America's truck-borne commerce across I-80. Wyoming, with its small population of 500,000–600,000 people, cannot possibly support that kind of truck traffic that is supporting over 100 million people. We can't do it. We can't support our share of I-80 off of, again, WYDOT is an enterprise-funded agency supposed to fund itself through things such as gasoline tax. I didn't support the most recent 10-cent gasoline tax because it's such a small thing. You're looking at a $35 million potential revenue increase if it all shakes out the way that it was designed to. WYDOT has a shortfall of $450 million. So our only alternative there is either to go to the feds and try and get that in the transportation bill from Congress. Good luck there. Or look at manipulating the federal mineral royalties, which is the federal's version of extractive taxes, the severance tax at the state level, federal mineral royalties. That's the only place that has the kind of revenues available to look at the shortfall that YDOT's experiencing. Hundreds of millions in shortfall versus tens of millions in tax to be gained by fuel tax increases. And there's potential there for unfairness as well. We looked at lawsuits. You're looking at competing transportation modes paying for highways. The biggest taxpayer in Wyoming is the railroad. The railroad's not going to pay a fuel tax that supports highways. That's not ever going to happen. So you've got to craft fuel tax laws very carefully so that the road users are who's paying for the maintenance on the roads and nobody else is. Same thing with aircraft fuel. You don't want to have a situation where you've got an at-the-rack tax where fuel that goes to aircraft, agriculture is exempt, you got railroad. You don't want to have those people paying for tax for their competitors. They won't stand for it. So you have to be very careful with that. So our great hope is federal help as well as some manipulation we can do with FMRs, but we're still in declining mineral production. So very tricky situation with the Revenue Committee to manipulate the percentages that go out and come back to Wyoming.
The feds aren't looking to lose that revenue either. Highway funding.
Yeah, so highway funding is a tricky issue. Let me start with the recently enacted gas tax. This was a 10-cent increase on fuel that brought our tax here in Wyoming in line with other states in the region. And as had been in the press a little bit lately, we haven't seen a commensurate 10-cent increase at the pump. And I think that the numbers I've read have indicated about $71 million in additional revenue annually based on that increase. And this was a bill that received broad support from a number of coalitions, transportation groups, tourist groups, industry groups. So I think that was a good start. And Representative Gay is correct. I mean, there is still a gap that we have to close. But I think it's important to recognize our role as state legislators. No matter who's in this district, we're not going to be able to go to Washington, D.C. and tell them that, hey, we need more federal funding. That's why we have 2 senators and a representative. The federal mineral severance tax is going to go to Washington, and they're going to determine how to spend it. So I'm not exactly sure how one would manipulate that from a state legislative standpoint to direct more funding towards roads. I think that what we need to look at, and this is more of an overarching issue for me, is that we have $1.8 billion in the rainy day account. That's gaining less than 1% interest. It's not even keeping pace with inflation. We have good revenues. We're very blessed in this state, and we need to sit down and have a hard discussion as a state legislature as to what projects should some of that money be put towards. And I'm not even talking about tapping the money that's already in there, but we continue to save at a very, very high rate. I think something like 30% is going into those accounts. And so would some of those monies be better spent in improving our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges? I mean, I-80 is a huge corridor, of course, but our industries, our mineral industries, coal, oil, gas, you name it, depend on our rural roads, our state bridges. And so we need to, as a state, make, I believe, a concerted effort to take some of that revenue and put them towards prudent, specifically targeted projects to close some of that shortfall. It's a very difficult issue because if you look back at the history of gasoline taxes that were meant to fund road construction and maintenance, for one, it's a per gallon, a cent per gallon tax. It's not a percent. So as cars have become more and more efficient, they're using less and less gas, and so commensurately we're paying less now in fuel tax than we were 30 or 40 years ago. And when you look at it, when it was 14 cents, that would have been 14 cents on a gallon of gas. It was $1. Now we're paying 24 cents on a gallon of gas. It's typically over $3 now. So I mean, as a percentage, we're paying less per gallon now. So I mean, that is, but the road and wear and tear has remained the same. So that is a difficult issue. And so, like I said, I think that the gas tax increase was a good start. It was a start that had broad sweeping support, but we need to look at using some of our state monies to put towards some of these projects.
So you mentioned rainy day funds a couple different times as far as potential solutions.
Right.
There's no question there's significant reserves there, but how would you, if you had that available, where would you look at spending some of the money that's either going to that or that's there right now?
Right. I think
would you have a sort of priority list? I mean, this is all hypothetical,
sure.
obviously. But
I think that needs to be developed. I don't think that the state legislature has really even had that conversation. And so I think we need to sit down and say, what are our most pressing needs in the state? You know, is it infrastructure? Is it funding for early childhood education that didn't get fully funded? What are our number one priorities? And we need to develop a list. And then we need to essentially rank them and figure out what amounts make the most sense. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not against saving. We have the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund that we save, you know, a percentage of our mineral revenues. We can't touch the body of that, but we certainly use the interest. That's because of the rules can be invested a little bit, I guess, more diversely so that you can gain a little more revenue off it. But when you look at the $1.8 million in a legislative stabilization reserve account or the rainy day fund, I mean, that's because of the rules is getting less than 1%. And there was a study that came out from the Pew Institute on exactly this, looking at what levels should states be saving at. And Wyoming is way off the charts in terms of what we've got saved relative to our, you know, biennial budget. I mean, other states would just kill to have the revenue we have. But the question becomes, when is enough enough? And can we make prudent, wise investments in our state today that are going to pay dividends down the road? I mean, having good roads and having good bridges, having good infrastructure, good, you know, cabling, internet connections, I mean, that's going to make our state even more business ready. It's going to help to sell Wyoming as a place to do business, help us diversify our economy. So when we have the natural ebbs and flows in the mineral industry, we're not as impacted. So in short answer to your question, I think we need to, as a legislature, have that discussion as a starting place and figure out where we should be strategically investing the money.
That's a question of you as far as reserve accounts. And having, if that money was available, where you would spend it, and just sort of the philosophy of saving that kind of money, where are you at on that?
I didn't mean to pick out game and fish in the early part of the discussion, but we've overgrown our government for years and years and years. Ever since this last natural gas boom, we've seen our state go from less than $1 billion budget to over $4 billion in the period of 12 years. So you've seen tremendous growth of government. 2 years ago, when I served on Labor, Health, and Social Service Committee, we were deposing a department head in a committee meeting. And my question to him was, Mr. Director, do you see opportunities to cut back on waste, fraud, and abuse in your department? And he laughed. He said, I see people drive up in front of my office every day in an Escalade, was his exact term. He said, they drive up in front of my office in an Escalade, come in and ask for their state subsidy from my department. I said, what do you do about that? He says, it's a means-tested program, but they have no proof of means necessary or required. So we pay the check. That's our job, is to write the check to them. We need to tighten up on the waste, fraud, and abuse across the whole state spectrum. Social services have gotten way out of hand. There's so much waste, fraud, and abuse there. When you look at the necessary things or necessities and the business-friendly environment, such as he was talking about with internet cable, optic cable within the easements, easements procured to get electricity out of the state. These are the sort of things that are productive, and we should have more emphasis on that, and an emphasis on running a tighter ship and eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, especially among the social programs.
Other than, or before you potentially think about spending any sort of reserve funds, is that what I'm hearing?
I would like to hold the directors of the department's feet to the fire. They get around the legislature by setting rules. And they can set a rule that anybody that walks in can sign up for their program regardless. We have millionaires out there signing up for state assistance. Until they can show me that they've made progress there, I'm not going to keep pouring, especially out of the rainy day fund, into that. We're constitutionally mandated to feed the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, and these rainy day funds are what we're able to put in above and beyond that, and I think we've been very prudent in what we've slushed into those, because the rainy day is coming if it's not upon us already. You know, the state is there to help them balance the budget, but we've got to meet the agencies part way. There is so much waste, fraud, and abuse you wouldn't believe. So when they've tightened up their ship, come back to the state with a tight budget, and we will be ready to help you out.
Let me ask you a question specifically for you, Representative Gay. What's a vote that you've made that you do differently, and what's a vote that you've made that you've been particularly proud of?
Over the last couple years, the legislature has been beset by people that want social change. They want the legislature to intervene in their personal, private lives. I took a vote a year ago in committee that I was proud of. It was a very controversial vote, and it had to do with same-sex marriage. We have in our Constitution what's called a morality clause, and it says essentially that the legislature will pass such laws as to maintain the morality and temperance in the state of Wyoming. I voted against same-sex marriage, and I'm equally proud of voting against the lottery. I think that's an intemperate activity, and it may prove to be an economic disaster. It hasn't been in place long enough that I can tell you whether it's going to be self-sustaining or profitable. We just don't have enough data to be able to tell you that. What vote am I least proud of? Gosh, let me pick my brain for a minute. I voted on some very controversial issues. I brought a bill on Sharia law several years ago, and probably am sorriest that I failed to push that through. The committee chairman asked me if he could table that bill. It came before him right on the eve of the Arab Spring, and he said, look, this is a very dynamic situation. I don't want to tackle Sharia law while the Arab Spring is on. So I said, go ahead and table that. That wasn't a proper vote, but it was my discretion. I told the chairman that he could table that vote. Here we are 2 years later, 2.5 years later. The Arab Spring has run its course. Democracy has failed in the Muslim portions of the world. We now have the rise of ISIS, and we're looking at bringing in refugees from the Congo and Somalia into Wyoming. And with them, they will bring Sharia law. It's a custom among certain peoples to invoke Sharia law, and they'll bring that with them. And we have no protection in there. There's a war against women embedded in Sharia law. You have a problem with such things as FGM, public dressing, lifestyles, the way that women are allowed to travel only with a male relative. Sharia law is antithetical to American law in general. So I'd say my least proud moment is the failure so far to stand up and put up a blockade against the practice of Sharia law in Wyoming.
That was an action-packed answer. Do you have any comment on any of them? We ticked off same-sex marriage, Sharia law, refugees, and the lottery.
Would you like me to? I'm actually
please. So what I am hearing is you're coming from very specific positions on a number of social issues, including Sharia law and refugees, if you want to cap those in there. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, let's start with same-sex marriage. I believe that everyone should have equal rights under the law. And I think Wyoming likes to tout itself as the equality state, and I think it's high time that we stand up and we live up to that mantra. Now, frankly, if one looks at the legal landscape, at the decisions out of the 10th Circuit and other federal circuits throughout the country, they're shooting down same-sex marriage bans, declaring it unconstitutional. So if we as a state do nothing, we may be in a position where the courts are going to tell us we have to allow it. And for some, I think that would be just fine. For me, personally, I'd like to see us be a little more proactive. And we talk about keeping government out of your life. And I think this is a prime example of that's exactly what would happen here if we allowed same-sex marriage. We need to stay out of people's lives. If they choose to marry whomever, they should have that opportunity. And this isn't a moral question. This is a legal question. It's one of, do I have equal protection under the law? If my spouse gets sick, do I have access to those medical records? Can I make those medical decisions in a case where there's children involved? Do I have the same rights in the courts? And I think that needs to be extended to everyone. So to me, I fully support same-sex marriage in Wyoming. As far as the Wyoming lottery, I don't have a problem with that. That was enacted. I mean, it by all projections, it looks to have, we're going to get some revenue. It's hard to project exactly how much. It is very new, but fundamentally that was a decision I think that was made, that was popular. Don't have a problem with it. Sharia law. I've been an attorney for 17 years. I've practiced the last 14 years here in Wyoming. And I know a lot of attorneys, and I can tell you that never once has this ever become an issue in any court proceeding in the state. And somehow the implication that should we as a state enact a state law that would ban Sharia law would somehow affect ISIS or anything else in the world is really a non sequitur. To me, this is not an issue in Wyoming. This is, I think, an indication that this district needs representation that's going to focus on issues that matter to the people of House District 36, that matter to the people in the state of Wyoming, whether that's education, healthcare, game and fish. Those are the issues that matter. I've knocked 8,000 doors, my campaign has, in the district. We've talked to over 2,000 people. I can tell you the main issues right now are education. People are concerned about the coal industry and jobs, economic growth. Not once have I ever heard that Sharia law was an issue. So to me, I mean, it's a non-issue. Doesn't need to be addressed. And was there one other?
I believe refugees were also attached to
so this,
Sharia law.
Yeah, and so this is, I think, a proposal that Governor Meade has brought about. And I'm not really super familiar with the details of that. I don't see that if the governor's proposal were to go through and we were to receive some, that would be a big impact on the state. But I can't, frankly, speak to the merits of that decision of the governor to apply for that status. At this point, I'm just not familiar enough with it.
One last question, this is specifically for you,
Sure.
Mr. Nelson. So, a Democrat in a chamber dominated by Republicans in a very red state.
Sure.
How would you advance your proposals? How would you actually accomplish anything that you want to accomplish?
Well, fundamentally what I want to do is take a very pragmatic, common sense approach down to Cheyenne. I mean, I know our local legislators. I know Tom Lockhart. I know Tim Stubson. I'm the president of the Chamber of Commerce. I definitely understand business issues. And I think that's what Wyoming people want. They don't want somebody that's going to go down there very ideologic and say, this is my position and I'm not going to budge. We need to do what's right for the state, and that means working with everyone. And I know that all too well as a Democrat, that if I want to get anything done, I have to work with everyone, and that's what I want to do. And when I talk to potential constituents, it doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, unaffiliated, I want to be there to represent their interests and the interests of Wyoming. And so I think that's the Wyoming way. I think we have a long history. If you look at the Cowboy Code of Ethics, you roll up your sleeves and you get it done. And you can be tough and you can advocate zealously for your beliefs, But democracy was founded on the principle of compromise, and so we need to find that middle ground. And frankly, I think if you were to poll every Wyomingite, you'd find that the majority of people are right down that center line, and they appreciate that kind of approach, and that's the approach that I want to take.
In response to that, Representative Gay, to the question or to his answer?
No, he's on the right track with representative government. We're not a true democracy, we're a republic. So we're elected to represent the people who send us down there. It's Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution. When I knock the doors, there is profound disagreement with same-sex marriage. You'll hear equality state thrown out. Equality state is a motto. It's not a policy. It's not in our Constitution. It's not there. The reason that we became the equality state is we didn't have enough population to become a state unless we included women in the vote. So that's why we took the lead in women's suffrage back in the day, so that we'd have enough voters to have the positions to achieve statehood. But equality state is a motto. It's not a policy. It's a good policy, and I believe in equal rights for all people. Not to be an ideologue, but you also have to have beliefs in something. You can't believe in anything. The next step beyond that is believing in nothing. And I think that we are headed as a society in that direction. When you see what we've done with religion over the years and political correctness, I think we're headed that direction. I've got in front of me a book in which the commentator wrote an article in 1985 about the death of the last Soviet premier, and what a profound effect watching them bury this old Soviet premier in the Kremlin wall had on him, because the Soviet Union was founded on a belief in nothing. And we don't want to head there. We don't want to become like the Soviet Union. We want to have our beliefs, and they have to reflect the beliefs of the constituents in the District 36.
So I'll give you both a minute to wrap up, and I'd like you to frame kind of your closing statement, and what's the biggest difference between you and your opponent?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and answer some questions and tell people a little bit about myself. I think for the first time in a number of years, House District 36 has a clear choice. Last go round, it was an uncontested position. And I think the main difference between myself and the incumbent, Representative Gay, is the philosophical approach that I want to take to Cheyenne. I want to go down there, like I said, and basically use some common sense. And what I mean by common sense is that I want to listen to my constituents, and as evidenced by our massive effort to get out and touch as many people in House District 36 and listen to what issues are important to them, and then go down to Cheyenne and work with all legislators, all stakeholders, regardless of party affiliation, to craft pragmatic solutions to the issues that are facing Wyoming. And in doing so, I want to base it on statistics, on the best information possible, and not go down there with preconceived notions, not go down there as an ideologue, but as somebody who is a servant of the people of the state, of the district. And I think that is a fundamentally different approach than has been taken in the past. I think my opponent feels very passionately about issues, and I think goes down there with a preconceived notion how to do things. And that's going to be different with me. I think that's the most fundamental change. And it doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, but philosophically, that's, I think, the biggest difference between us.
Well, I agree that we should all go down there with a common sense approach, and pragmatism has always been part of my basket. I'm not among the most extreme down there, although I'm a fiscal conservative. It's incumbent upon us to look to the future and not wait until the train hits us. We're in a situation of revenue decline, and times call for fiscal conservatism. I would like to see us spend less time on social issues. Government has little business in people's family matters and personal matters. So I'd like to see us spend less time on that, more time on being fiscally responsible. A couple things that I would like to be specific about is the line items, or what we call footnotes in the budget. That's a grossly manipulated feature of the budget. The legislature goes down and passes a budget based on footnotes by the thousands, and before the ink is dry on the budget, the executive branch has at its discretion the ability to change the budget footnotes. I'd like to see that tightened up. The legislature is who holds the purse strings and nobody else. So when we sign that budget or send that budget in, the executive can veto it if he doesn't like it, but once he signs it, I want him to keep his fingers out of manipulating the footnotes.
Well, thank you both again for coming in, and it's a pleasure speaking with both of you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.